Look at a map, and what do you see? Lines traced across an expanse of global space. Lines that demarcate territories, cultures, governments, and economies. We inhabit a world of nations. One might say that the nation is the political form of modernity. It's how we organize our societies, how we identify ourselves and others. We believe that nations have the right to speak for an entire group of people, that they are legitimate and sovereign entities. And yet when asked, what is a nation? People will provide different answers, citing government, cultural traits, state structures, and politics as all being somehow indicative of what a nation is. Yet if we look at nations in a historical context, we might say that they are the products of certain processes that have come to shape the social and political landscape of the modern world. And in this respect, when we speak of nations, we are talking about a historical phenomenon that continues to exert a lasting and important impact on the present. While we tend to think of nations as old and possessing long genealogies stretching back centuries, in reality, nations are a relatively new concept. The term nation, as we might understand it today, came into common usage in the 18th century. During this period, elites frustrated with the absolutist rule of monarchs began speaking of the nation as something in its own right. A nation existed independent of the monarchy, they believed, entailing a ruler could not simply do as they wished and was even obliged to rule in the interest of the nation over which they ruled. By the late 18th century, certain thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and others in France went as far as to claim that the nation was a sovereign authority in itself, standing above the monarch. These ideas naturally fed into more radical programs, inspiring certain political elites to make broad calls for reform and political change in the name of the nation. What is a nation? Asked the French cleric Emmanuel de Sieyès in 1788. A body of associates living under a common law and represented by the same legislature. This exceedingly democratic understanding of nationhood would provide the basis for radical and even revolutionary movements in the late 18th century. In the Americas and in Europe, elites came to invest the nation with a new authority. In challenging royal rule and power, they insisted that the nation not only had a right to exist and express itself, but that it was the sole authority in society. Revolutions on the broad basis of national sovereignty and government by representation are making their way in Europe, claimed the English political thinker Thomas Paine. It is an age of revolutions in which everything may be looked for. In the minds of French and New World revolutionaries, national association and identification signified a new era of democracy and the rule of the people. In challenging royal authority, they asserted that it was the people, or the nation, that was the sovereign authority. People belonged to this nation by virtue of the rights and laws they shared with their fellow co-nationals, equating the idea of national association with a new concept: citizenship. It was, as Sieyès claimed, the great body of citizens that made up a nation. And as the French revolutionary Maximilien Robespierre claimed, this dictated that every citizen had the right to participate in making the laws of the nation and serve the community by partaking in politics. The so-called Age of Revolution that occurred in the late 18th century was, in fact, a citizenship revolution. One that redefined the relationship between state and people, and with it, advanced claims for democratic government and rule. Under the banner of liberty, equality, and fraternity, revolutionaries committed themselves to establishing new republican and democratic states based upon the principle of popular sovereignty. In fact, French revolutionaries were so confident in this new form of political association, they were inspired to impose it on others. Over the next 2 decades, French armies marched across Europe, drafting constitutions and creating new national governments that would radically transform the political geography of continental Europe. At the turn of the century, revolutionary forces commanded by Napoleon Bonaparte introduced ideas of citizenship and national fraternity from Spain to Russia. This type of nation building from above may not have reflected the more democratic and popular aspects of revolutionary nationalism first announced in the 1770s and 1780s, but it did spread the idea of national association and government across the continent, entrenching it in European political life. As Napoleon moved across the continent and cobbled together a new revolutionary French empire, the idea of national association became the leitmotif of the revolutionary age. Although the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars gave a new impetus to ideas of nationalism, they were not explicit creations of the revolutionary period. In fact, many of these ideas had been circulating in Europe for decades, encouraging conceptions of nationhood that were distinct from enlightened and republican ideas of civic participation and natural rights. During the 18th century, intellectuals had begun to ask questions about what made a people. Whereas Rousseau claimed it was participation in politics and one's citizenship that tied them to a society, others insisted that a people was more than just a community of equal citizens. Outside of political considerations, Enlightenment scholars also emphasized the important role environment and history played in social development. Communities were bound by certain customs and traditions unique to them. These features were what gave groups their specific national character, as intellectuals argued. Without these common traits, there existed no idea of a shared history or community. In essence, nations were not political creations, as Rousseau had posited. They were, in fact, products of culture and historical development, with deep roots stretching back centuries. Over the next decade, these ideas would come to constitute the base of a new intellectual movement in Europe: Romanticism. A new generation of German thinkers was particularly taken by these intellectual currents in the late 18th century and early 19th century. And it was specifically the Prussian-born pastor and philosopher Johann Gottfried von Herder who would emerge as the leading figure of the German Romantics. For Herder, the nation or the people were products of deeply rooted cultural traits. Each people had a particular character that was formed through its own history, experiences, and most importantly, through its common language and culture shared with others. These commonalities were what united fellow Germans, he insisted. And in coming together as one people and society, the spirit of the German people, what Herder called its Volkgeist, was expressed and realized. The sense of nationalism promoted by Herder and his followers was spiritual in nature. The individual was nothing. Only by uniting with their fellow national brothers could individuals possess any force and be capable of realizing the destiny which history had prescribed for them. This sentiment was celebrated in Beethoven's famous Ode to Joy, intoning "Laufet Beute eure Bahn, freudig wie ein Helm zu siegen." It was this hope of unity and brotherhood that early German nationalists praised and desired to be realized among the German people, scattered throughout Central and Eastern Europe. This cultural bond was the seed of a yet unrealized German fatherland, which would unite all Germans under one state and one homeland. If the French and Americans prized democracy and revolution as the basis for a nation, German thinkers like Herder preferred what they called the Kulturstaat, a cultural state defined more by ethnic identification and historical process than a commitment to a shared democratic heritage or common base of rights. The Enlightenment and the revolutionary values promoted by the French were not necessarily those of the German people, the logic went. The ideas of reason and individualism promoted by French philosophers may have been the expression of a French way of life and thought, but Germans had their own unique system of thought and feeling, one that could only fully be realized through the creation of a national community. It was in this sense alone that a people could be truly free. Unsurprisingly, these ideas of national association and brotherhood were taking shape during the period of Napoleonic expansion across Europe. French thinkers and administrators may have spread ideas of nationalism wherever they planted the tricolor flag. But nationalism also contained the roots of a resistance movement, and more specifically, resistance to invasion and occupation by Napoleonic forces. As Napoleonic forces marched across the continent, nationalists and patriots stirred up anti-French sentiments with appeals to national identity and the defense of German culture. Between 1804 and 1808, the Romantic philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte wrote a series of addresses to the German nation for this exact end. Influenced by Herder and his circle, Fichte desired to spread ideas of German cultural unity and identity, hoping to nurture patriotic feelings among German elites that would encourage the creation of a German nation-state. As luck would have it, Fichte found moral and financial support for his cause from the British government. London was not necessarily sympathetic to the new Romantic movement emanating among German intellectuals, but British policymakers clearly saw its utility. In appealing to the German nation, an entity which hardly existed at this time, they hoped Fichte and other writers might incite a patriotic resistance to Napoleon, bogging down his forces in local wars and weakening the French hold over Central Europe. In these addresses, Fichte made appeals to a unique German identity. He compared the current French invasion to the invasion of the Romans 2 millennia before, insisting that the Germans had resisted Roman culture and influence in their striving to remain free. In defending their own traditions and identity, the Germans had asserted their right to exist as a people, and it was this same defense of Deutschtum that was now under threat from the French. The appeals of writers like Fichte left their mark, generating a liberation war, or Freiheitskrieg, among the German states that would see French forces expelled from Central Europe by 1814. While the German nation envisioned by thinkers like Herder and Fichte did not materialize in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, the cultural revivalist movements taking shape in Germany by the early 19th century were not insignificant. Through recourse to history and cultural identification, elites claimed that they had discovered the organic roots of a German people, and in doing so, advanced powerful arguments favoring the creation of a German state. Political unity would complement and fulfill the existing cultural unity binding Germans together. Whereas in France and the American Republic, revolutionary state building had provided the basis for a common understanding of the nation and citizen, in Germany, this process was reversed. Culture and language became the basis of a shared German identity, which, defined as a nationality, had a right to its own state and government. It was evident that nationalism was not simply imagined as a cultural movement. It was a political program, one that encouraged and even justified state-building projects. More importantly, these ideas struck a powerful chord beyond Germany. In the 19th century, continental Europe was hardly the assemblage of nation-states and national governments it is today. On the contrary, Central and Eastern Europe were vast multi-ethnic empires, ruled by dynastic monarchies, and populated by a mosaic of ethnic groups. As ideas stemming from the French Revolution and the Romantic movement spread, others began to take up these ideas and press them into service. In Germany and throughout Central Eastern Europe, scholars set to the task of recording local histories, carrying out archaeological surveys, and organizing campaigns to preserve historical buildings. The most famous of these folklorists were Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm, two brothers who collected and published traditional German folktales in an effort to preserve the oral traditions and therefore cultural memory of the German people. The brothers Grimm were two among a growing number of scholars fascinated by traditions and popular forms of culture typically ignored by scholars in the past. In recording these tales, folklorists saw themselves as discovering the authentic nation, and soon enough, Romantics began turning out scholarly works of history, detailing the collective struggles and achievements of their people. Historians as well turned to the past in search of new origin stories that could foster a sense of shared identity and belonging. Narratives of how nations formed and evolved over time, of the events and collective experiences that defined a people, became the substance of a new style of history writing in the 19th century, one that implicitly sought to validate the nation as an object of history, and therefore as an undisputed truth. Historians in Spain, France, and Germany began to write national histories, and through them, chronicle the trial and tribulations of their people. Prominent among these national historians was Leopold von Ranke, a German scholar typically considered the first professional historian. Like many of his generation, Ranke was not simply concerned with providing a history for the German people. He clearly understood that history furnished the basis on which a future German nation-state was to be built. As Ranke stated in 1836, "It is the task of history to define the nature of the state on the basis of past events and to make this known." Consistent with trends in popular culture and national history, scholars also became interested in the study of languages. Philology, or the study of linguistic origins, witnessed its heyday in the years following the Napoleonic Wars. Scholars dedicated significant attention to writing dictionaries and tracing the development of language groups, and in doing so, they codified and standardized certain languages, transforming them into nominally national tongues. During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, for example, Romanian philologists wrote a series of history and grammar books that would assist in standardizing the various Slavic and Latin-derived dialects spoken in the Eastern European region. Romanian lexicographers made a conscious decision to use the Latin rather than the Cyrillic alphabet in developing a standardized Romanian script. They also purged the language of noticeably Slavic words, accenting a certain idea of national particularism in their work that would encourage the development of a Latinized Romanian nationality in the coming years. Language, culture, and history all came together to inform a new idea of identity, one that scholars and intellectuals did not hesitate to label as national. Drawing upon new influences, Europeans from Spain to Romania were coming to see both themselves and their respective societies in new terms. While national revivalism may have originated in countries like France and Germany, people found the new idioms of national selfhood extremely flexible. They could adapt ideas on culture and identification to their own particular circumstances, and through them, imagine their own communities in national terms. The spread of nationalism over the 19th century was in large part due to its broad, modular quality. The fact that it could be applied almost anywhere and provide a set of arguments justifying the existence of a particular community. There was, of course, a certain irony to all this. The idea of the nation was, from its origins, transnational in nature. It was a concept and set of discourses that was not particular to any single place or culture, a fact that became evident as thoughts on national identification took root across continental Europe and, ultimately, the world. Early proponents of national association saw themselves as engaged in acts of discovery. Looking to history and factors like culture and language, they believed that they were unearthing the deep roots and lineages connecting present-day societies with the past. This primordialism, or this desire to see present-day communities extending backward over centuries, all the way to their originary source, gave the idea of the nation a certain organic naturalness. Yet despite what early national theorists claimed, they were hardly discovering what was there before them. In fact, national theorists were investing the very nations they studied with their own objective reality. By focusing on language and culture, early nationalists provided criteria for thinking about what, at base, united a people. Historians reinforce this sense of unity, tracing the contours of a common past and set of collective memories that instructed people to identify with a set of traditions and experiences shared with fellow citizens and countrymen. Such writers and scholars were engaging in an imaginative process, one that made the idea of the nation real and tangible. To use Benedict Anderson's famous phrase, nations were imagined communities. Yet if nations were products of the mind, this did not make them any less real for those inhabiting them. In many respects, their ultimate reality stemmed from the fact that during the 19th century, politicians and elites went to great efforts to actually build nations, providing what was imaginary with material form and substance. During the century, people and societies were effectively nationalized. Political leaders and elites set to the task of creating nominally national institutions, giving rise to a host of foundations and organizations that were intended to promote national identities. National parliaments and political assemblies were established in various European countries, all claiming to represent the will and voice of the nation. Over the course of the 19th century, politics became increasingly democratized, but also nationalized. The nation was imagined as a source of sovereignty, entailing that all laws and political policies emanated directly from it. National museums, libraries, and theaters were also constructed designed to promote national culture or serve as a repository for the nation's history and collective memory. In order to make the national idea a reality, people had to be taught to see themselves as belonging to a nation. Traditionally, most identities had been local or regional, with the mass of European peasants possessing little understanding of belonging to a larger community beyond their immediate locality. In many cases, rural communities spoke their own regional dialects, demonstrating that standardized national languages were hardly widespread outside of a small section of educated elites. With nations came, therefore, a new turn toward mass education and state institutions intended to produce good patriots and citizens. State schools were set up where students received instruction in a national tongue. In classrooms, they learned about the history of their country and were instructed to identify with a community and set of values common to all fellow citizens. This was the hard and long work associated with nation building. It required changing people's minds and outlooks and making them see themselves in new and vital ways. Nationalism also encouraged a new type of symbolism and discourse. National flags, anthems, and monuments provided the means of representing the nation, making what was abstract real and omnipresent in the lives of citizens. Memorials honoring heroes or celebrating great achievements from history all acquired a national character, providing physical reminders and common reference points designed to foster a sense of national unity and commonality among a people. This even extended into the arts, where national themes such as war and politics were conveyed to audiences, reinforcing the idea of a shared past and heritage. In essence, nationalism was an ambitious social, political, and cultural project that aimed to mold citizens and build national communities, in many instances from the ground up. Nation-building projects throughout the century effectively made the concept of the nation real and intelligible to mass audiences. Yet it also revealed one of the central paradoxes of nationalism itself. Political and intellectual elites confidently spoke of nations with common features and deep historical roots. Yet their actions constantly revealed the fact that the nation was by no means the natural and organic entity they supposed. national communities were willed into existence through the action of nation builders, who set out to re-educate entire populations and effectively nationalize landscapes and cultures. There was nothing natural or innate in this process. Nations were built and manufactured, entrenching national identifications at the center of politics and social life. Through these efforts, the nation became a sacred source of authority, which could command allegiances and claim to be a repository of a people's history, culture, and identity. The Italian sociologist Alfredo Nicifero said it best when reflecting on the task that lay ahead for the newly created Italian kingdom brought into existence in 1871. The Italian nation has been created, he claimed. It is now essential to create the Italian people. What is a nation? Asked the French philosopher Ernest Renan in 1882. This question had been central to European scholarship over much of the preceding century. For Renan, national life signified a collective will to live together. It was a community that remembered together, but also forgot together, that experienced the common achievements and traumas that united a people. Whether revolutionary or conservative in its outlook, nationalism ushered in a new ideology and project that would have profound implications for the world. By the 20th century, the nation was recognized as a legitimate and even natural form of political and social organization, challenging older ideas of dynastic and imperial rule. With the end of the First World War, nation-states and national kingdoms were established throughout Europe, the Americas, and much of the Middle East. Statehood implied the recognition of a people's political and cultural sovereignty, and the nation-state came to express this status. For many, national association also implied a transition to modernity, a process through which a people or group could shape their own society, develop their resources and infrastructure, and engage with the world at large on a theoretically equal footing. In this light, the nation became an axiomatic feature of the modern world order, providing a model of social organization that would command loyalties within a given territory, shape collective identities, and claim to legitimately speak for a group or people. Nations may have been imagined, but nation building made these imaginary constructions real and meaningful, embedding them in the political, social, and cultural processes that forged the modern world.